Some strangers are never meant to stay strangers. The storm arrived faster than anyone expected. One moment the road stretched peacefully beneath a gray evening sky. The next, rain hammered against my windshield so hard I could barely see 20 feet ahead. Wind shook my truck from side to side while distant thunder rolled across the hills surrounding the small town where I had lived my entire life. Most people had already made it home. I should have done the same. Instead, I was driving back from a teacher conference in the neighboring county, gripping the steering wheel tightly as sheets of rain blurred the world into streaks of white and gray. My name is Grace Walker. I was 28 years old, a second-grade teacher, and completely unprepared for the decision that would change my life forever. The radio station had stopped broadcasting 20 minutes earlier. Cell service disappeared shortly after. The storm seemed determined to erase every connection to the outside world. I slowed as I approached a narrow section of highway that cut through a heavily wooded area. Water rushed across parts of the pavement. Branches littered the shoulder. Lightning flashed somewhere beyond the trees. Then I saw it. First, I thought it was another fallen branch, a dark shape near the edge of the road. But another flash of lightning illuminated the scene. My stomach dropped immediately. An SUV sat partially off the roadway, tilted awkwardly near a drainage ditch. One headlight remained on. The other blinked weakly through the rain. I passed it by nearly 50 yards before instinct took over. My hands tightened on the wheel. Every reasonable thought told me to keep driving. The storm was getting worse. It was dangerous to stop. Someone else would eventually come along. But deep down I already knew I was turning around. The windshield wipers struggled to keep pace as I carefully maneuvered back toward the SUV. Rain pounded against the roof. The wind screamed through the trees. My heart raced as I parked several yards away and grabbed my flashlight. The moment I stepped outside, icy rain soaked through my jacket. Water splashed around my boots as I hurried toward the vehicle. "Hello," I shouted. My voice disappeared into the storm. No response. Lightning flashed again. The SUV looked expensive. New. Completely out of place on a remote country road. I reached the driver's side window and shined my flashlight inside. A man sat motionless behind the wheel. My pulse jumped. For one terrifying second I thought he was gone. Then I noticed the faint rise and fall of his chest. Relief washed over me. He was alive. The man looked to be in his late 30s. Dark hair. Strong features. Expensive clothing. Even unconscious, he carried an unusual presence. The kind that made people pay attention without understanding why. Water streamed down the glass while I checked the door. Locked. "Come on," I whispered. The driver's side window was slightly cracked. Just enough. I called out again. No response. Thunder shook the air. The storm showed no sign of slowing. I knew I could not leave him there. Not tonight. Not in weather like this. My flashlight beam swept across the interior again. Then something changed. The stranger stirred slightly, barely noticeable. His head shifted against the seat. A faint groan escaped his lips. My heart hammered inside my chest. "Hey," I called. "Can you hear me?" Another flash of lightning illuminated his face. Slowly, painfully, his eyes began to open. And in that exact moment, standing beside a stranded SUV in the middle of a storm, neither of us realized that fate had already made its choice. The stranger stirred as I carefully helped him out of the SUV, water dripping from his hair and clothes, rain soaking us both, the storm still hammering the trees and the road, making every step dangerous. I wrapped my jacket around him, trying to provide some warmth, my heart racing from adrenaline and concern. He was heavier than expected, but his unconscious state left me no choice but to support most of his weight as we navigated toward my truck parked a few yards back. I kept talking to him, low reassurances against the roar of thunder. Lightning revealed the tense lines of his face, the hint of exhaustion under his sharp features. Once in the truck, I started the engine, windshield wipers barely keeping up with the torrent, and drove to the small cabin my family owned on the outskirts, far enough from the town lights to avoid any unnecessary attention. Every mile felt interminable. The road was slick and visibility minimal, but the thought of leaving him in the storm made each careful turn imperative. I finally reached the cabin, mud splashing as I parked near the door, and together we stumbled inside, the warmth from the wood stove immediately contrasting the cold rain outside. I helped him to a chair, noticing the subtle tension in his muscles even in repose. He shifted slightly, opening his eyes again, revealing a piercing gaze that seemed to study me before retreating to a weariness that suggested long nights and complex burdens. I offered a blanket and he accepted without a word, eyes scanning the small room, taking in the simplicity and the solitude. I fetched a glass of water and set it near him, noticing his hands strong but calloused, hinting at a life of action and authority. The storm continued outside, but inside, there was a rare stillness, a quiet that seemed to both comfort and amplify the unknown. I glanced at his clothes, damp and clinging, the leather jacket dark and heavy, and wondered about the life that brought him to this remote road on such a violent night. He coughed softly, a low sound that made me lean forward in instinctive concern, and I offered assistance, which he declined with a subtle nod, a small acknowledgement of gratitude hidden beneath the calm exterior. Moments passed in silence, the fire casting dancing shadows across the walls, highlighting his angular features and the faint traces of fatigue etched onto them. I realized I had no idea who he was, yet a profound sense of responsibility anchored me to him in this moment. The air smelled of wet wood and rain, the storm outside creating a rhythmic percussion against the roof, each strike reminding me of the urgency of tonight, the delicate thread that separated safety from peril. I kept watch, noting his breathing, slight shifts and quiet groans, each a confirmation of life, and yet the mystery of the man remained, compelling, enigmatic, and undeniably connected to the night. That began as an ordinary drive but had transformed into a moment of fateful consequence. The storm finally began to weaken sometime before dawn. Rain still tapped against the cabin windows, but the violent wind had faded into a distant whisper moving through the trees. I must have fallen asleep in the chair near the fireplace because the next thing I remember was the pale glow of morning sunlight slipping across the wooden floor. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then I remembered the stranger. My eyes moved immediately toward the couch where I had left him. Empty. I sat upright so quickly the blanket slid from my shoulders. The cabin was silent. Too silent. I stood and searched the small room. The blanket remained folded neatly on the couch. The glass of water sat empty on the table beside it. The front door was closed. Nothing appeared disturbed. It was as though he had simply vanished into the morning. Confused, I stepped outside. The storm had transformed the landscape. Puddles reflected the brightening sky. Mist drifted between the trees. The road leading toward town looked muddy but passable. There was no sign of the stranger anywhere. I walked several yards from the cabin, scanning the area. Nothing. No footprints I could follow. No vehicle. No explanation. Just silence. Eventually I returned inside. Part of me felt relieved. He was clearly well enough to leave. Another part of me felt strangely disappointed. We had barely spoken. I did not know his name. I did not know where he came from. I only knew that for a few hours, our lives had crossed paths in the middle of a storm. As I began straightening the cabin, I noticed something unusual resting on the table near the fireplace. A watch. Not an ordinary watch. Even someone like me, who knew almost nothing about expensive things, could immediately tell it was valuable. The silver case gleamed in the morning light. The craftsmanship looked flawless. Picked it up carefully. Felt surprisingly heavy in my hand. The stranger must have left it behind. Accidentally. At least that was what I assumed at first. Then I noticed something else. The watch had been placed directly beside the empty glass of water. Deliberately. Not forgotten. Left. My confusion deepened. Why would someone leave behind something so valuable? I turned it over and found a small engraving on the back. Just 2 initials. Are. That was all. No phone number. No message. No clue. I slipped the watch into a drawer for safekeeping and tried to put the entire experience behind me. By late morning I was back in town. Life resumed its normal rhythm. Children laughed in classrooms. Parents picked up groceries. Conversations filled the sidewalks. Yet throughout the day my thoughts kept drifting back to the stranger. The intensity in his eyes when he briefly woke. The way he seemed constantly aware of his surroundings. The mystery surrounding his sudden disappearance. Something about the entire situation felt unfinished. That evening after returning home, I found myself staring out the window as the sun disappeared beyond the hills. The watch remained safely tucked away in the drawer. The stranger was gone. The storm had passed. Everything should have returned to normal. Yet deep inside, I could not shake the feeling that our story was not over. Somewhere beyond the quiet streets of our small town, a man with the initials AR was continuing his life. And neither of us knew it yet, but the storm had left behind far more than a watch. The following morning, sunlight filtered softly through the curtains, illuminating the quiet room. I moved slowly, still thinking about the stranger and the watch left behind. My name is Grace Walker, and my life had already felt ordinary and predictable until a single stormy night shifted everything. I prepared breakfast quietly, the aroma of fresh coffee filling the kitchen, but my mind kept returning to the events on that remote road. How had I never noticed the signs? The subtle urgency in his movements, the weight of experience in his gaze, the commanding presence that seemed at odds with the vulnerability I had seen for the brief moments he was conscious. As I cleaned the kitchen, the phone rang. A number I did not recognize flashed across the screen. Tentatively, I answered. "Hello." A deep voice, calm but compelling, spoke. "Grace Walker," it said, each syllable deliberate. "I believe we have unfinished business." I froze, my grip tightening on the receiver. The voice was authoritative, composed, yet it carried an intensity that immediately put me on edge. "Who is this?" I asked, trying to maintain a tone of normalcy, but curiosity overpowered my apprehension. "Someone who owes you an explanation," the voice replied. Then, as quickly as it started, the call ended. My heart raced. I set the phone down and moved to the living room, where the morning light created patterns on the floor, and stared out the window at the quiet street. The calmness of the neighborhood clashed with the turbulence I felt inside. I knew immediately that this was related to the stranger, the man with the initials AR, who had appeared out of nowhere, changing the trajectory of my ordinary life in a single rain-soaked night. I gathered my thoughts and decided I could not ignore it. I prepared to leave, grabbed a jacket, and took the watch from the drawer, running my fingers over the smooth metal surface. It was a tangible reminder of the connection, mysterious and intense, that had begun the previous night. Outside, the air was crisp, and the light breeze carried the faint scent of wet earth. The town seemed normal, uneventful, yet I could feel the underlying tension of the unknown waiting beyond the horizon. Every step toward my car felt heavy with anticipation, as if each motion pulled me closer to the story that was unfolding, and the man who had already entered my life in a way I could not ignore. I started the engine, the familiar hum comforting, yet the uncertainty loomed. As I drove, memories of the storm, the flash of lightning, the strain in his body, and the intensity of his eyes replayed vividly, making each street and turn feel loaded with significance. The watch in my pocket seemed to vibrate with purpose, a reminder that our paths were now intertwined, and that the events of last night were only the beginning of a story that would test courage, trust, and the boundaries of fate. I knew, deep in my bones, that the man who had appeared so unexpectedly would not remain a stranger for long, and the day ahead held encounters that would challenge everything I thought I understood about chance, human connection, and the invisible threads that bind lives together. The drive into town should have felt familiar. I had traveled those roads thousands of times, yet that morning every mile seemed different. The stranger had become a question I could not stop asking. The phone call echoed in my mind. "Someone who owes you an explanation." The words followed me all the way to school. I spent the morning teaching multiplication tables and helping 7-year-olds sound out difficult words, but my concentration drifted every few minutes. During lunch, I finally turned on the television in the teacher's lounge. The local news played quietly in the background while several teachers discussed weekend plans. I barely paid attention until a familiar face appeared on the screen. The remote slipped from my hand. My heart stopped. It was him. The stranger from the storm. The man from the cabin. The man who left the watch. He stood surrounded by reporters outside a skyscraper in downtown Chicago. Dark suit. Calm expression. The same sharp eyes I remembered from that stormy night. A headline appeared beneath the image. Adrian Romano attends major charity announcement. The room suddenly felt smaller. Louder. One of the teachers glanced at the screen and smiled. "That guy is everywhere lately." Another nodded.
Romano Industries. Romano Investments.
Half the city probably belongs to him. I stared at the television.
Adrian Romano. Are.
The initials on the watch. Everything clicked into place at once. The expensive vehicle. The watch. The confidence. The strange phone call. Somehow, the injured stranger I pulled from a storm had turned out to be one of the most powerful men in the state. I barely heard the rest of the broadcast. My thoughts raced. Why had someone like him been alone on that road? Why leave without saying goodbye? Why call me now? After school ended, I drove home beneath a clear blue sky. The storm felt like a distant memory, yet every answer seemed to create two new questions. As I stepped onto my front porch, I noticed a package resting beside the door. No shipping label. No delivery company. Just a simple brown box with my name written neatly across the top. Grace Walker. My pulse quickened. I carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. For several seconds I simply stared at it. Then I opened it. Inside sat a wooden case lined with dark velvet. Resting in the center was the watch. The same watch. Polished. Perfect. Beside it lay a folded note. My hands trembled slightly as I opened it. The message was short. Thank you for stopping that night. Most people would not have. There was no signature. None was necessary. I sat quietly at the table. Sunlight streamed through the window. Dust floated lazily through the warm afternoon air. The note remained in my hands while emotions I could not fully explain settled inside my chest. Gratitude. Curiosity. Confusion. Something else. Something deeper. For the first time since the storm, Adrian Romano no longer felt like a mystery from another world. He felt real. Human. A man who remembered. A man who cared enough to reach back across the distance between our lives. Outside, a black SUV slowly passed my house before continuing down the street. I watched it disappear through the window. Maybe it meant nothing. Maybe it meant everything. But one thing had become impossible to ignore. The storm had ended days ago. Yet somehow, its consequences were only beginning. The next morning, sunlight poured through the half-open blinds, casting long, sharp lines across the wooden floor. I moved carefully through the apartment, still carrying the weight of the previous day's events. My name is Grace Walker, and my life had been ordinary until a single stormy night had changed everything. I found myself staring at the watch Adrian Romano had left, its silver case gleaming even in the gentle morning light, and I felt a strange connection to someone I had known for only hours. As I dressed for the day, I kept thinking about the message left in the envelope, short and deliberate, yet carrying a sense of intimacy that I could not ignore. I left my apartment, the air crisp and clean, the city streets slowly filling with morning traffic. People moved along the sidewalks, absorbed in their routines unaware of the quiet drama unfolding in one small corner of the town. I kept glancing at my phone, half expecting another call, another message, anything that would hint at Adrian Romano's next move. It was during this walk that I noticed a sleek black car parked across the street, the windows tinted so dark I could not see inside. My pulse quickened. The car had appeared without warning, and for reasons I could not explain, I felt certain it was him. I stopped, adjusting the strap of my bag over my shoulder, and waited. After several tense moments, the car slowly drove past, and I exhaled, trying to calm the mixture of fear and excitement swirling inside me. I continued my journey, each step measured, my thoughts returning repeatedly to the man who had changed my life with a single act of fate. By the time I reached the small cafe near the corner, I felt almost dizzy from the intensity of my own emotions. The scent of fresh bread and coffee greeted me as I entered, and for a moment, the normalcy of the environment contrasted sharply with the chaos I felt inside. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching as people passed, unaware that lives intersected invisibly in ways that could never be predicted. Every face I saw reminded me of Adrian Romano, his eyes, his voice, the watch in my hand, and the subtle power he seemed to carry effortlessly. My mind replayed the storm, the moment I had extended help, the brief trust we had exchanged, and the weight of the choices now stretching ahead. I knew that whatever path lay before me, it would require courage, careful thought, and a willingness to step into the unknown. Outside, the city continued its rhythm, but for me, time had shifted, leaving me suspended between what was and what might be. The watch lay on the table, a constant reminder of the storm of Adrian Romano, and of the invisible threads now pulling our lives together, signaling that the story was far from over, and that the next chapter was already waiting to unfold. 3 days passed before I saw Adrian Romano again. Not on television. Not through a phone call. Not through another anonymous gift. In person. The day began like any other. I spent the morning at school helping my students prepare for a reading competition. Their excitement filled the classroom, creating the kind of joyful chaos only children could create. For a few hours I almost managed to forget about storms, watches, mysterious phone calls, and powerful strangers. Then everything changed. The final school bell rang shortly after 3 o'clock. Parents gathered outside. Children rushed toward waiting cars. I remained inside organizing papers on my desk when the principal appeared at my classroom door. "Grace," she said with an expression I could not immediately read. "There is someone here asking for you." My stomach tightened unexpectedly. "Who?" She smiled slightly. "You will want to see for yourself." Curious, I followed her toward the front office. The moment I stepped into the lobby, I stopped walking. Adrian stood near the entrance. Dark suit, calm posture, the same composed presence I remembered from the cabin. Yet seeing him here felt completely different. This was my world. My ordinary life. Somehow he looked even more out of place standing among colorful student artwork and bulletin boards covered in reading awards. Several office staff members pretended not to stare. They were failing completely. Adrian's eyes found mine immediately. A faint smile appeared. "Grace." Hearing my name in his voice felt strangely familiar. I approached slowly. "You could have called." His expression softened. I thought an apology deserved more than a phone call. I blinked. An apology? For leaving without saying goodbye. For a moment neither of us spoke. The afternoon sunlight streamed through the front windows, casting long golden shadows across the floor. Finally I laughed softly. "You disappeared before sunrise." "I know." There was genuine regret in his voice. "I have been regretting that decision ever since." The honesty caught me off guard. Adrian glanced around the office. Curious staff members suddenly became very interested in their paperwork. He lowered his voice slightly. "Would you walk with me?" 20 minutes later, we sat on a quiet bench overlooking a small lake near town. Autumn leaves drifted across the water while sunlight reflected in gentle waves. The scene felt peaceful, almost unreal. Adrian removed his jacket and sat beside me. Not too close, not distant either. Comfortable, respectful. For a while we simply watched the water. Then he finally spoke. "You saved my life that night." The words settled heavily between us. I looked down. Anyone would have stopped. Adrian shook his head immediately. "No." His voice remained calm. "Certain. Most people would have kept driving." I remembered the storm, the fear, the hesitation before turning my truck around. Maybe he was right. Maybe he was wrong. Either way, I was glad I stopped. Adrian leaned forward slightly. "You had no reason to help me. You did it anyway." His gaze moved toward the lake. "That matters more than you realize." Something in his expression changed then. The powerful businessman disappeared for a moment. In his place sat a man carrying loneliness he rarely allowed anyone to see. I suddenly understood something important. Adrian Romano was surrounded by people every day. Employees, advisors, executives. Yet very few of them actually saw him. The storm had stripped away everything except humanity. And for one night that had been enough. The wind moved gently through the trees. Neither of us seemed eager to leave. Because somewhere between the storm and this quiet afternoon beside the lake, a debt of gratitude had become something far more difficult to explain. The evening settled over the city like a velvet curtain, softening harsh lines of skyscrapers and streetlights. I walked beside Adrian, the rhythm of our steps matching the quiet hum of traffic around us, the world shrinking to just the space between us. My hands clutched my coat tightly, though the temperature had dipped only slightly. The storm had left a lingering chill that seemed to seep into bones. "It still feels unreal," I said, glancing at him. He kept his eyes forward, calm and composed, but there was a subtle warmth in his gaze that had not been there before. "What feels unreal?" he asked. I hesitated, thinking of how the storm, the crash, and the nights of uncertainty had all led to this moment, where the ordinary and the extraordinary collided. Effortlessly. Meeting you. Being here. Feeling seen, I admitted. Adrian's lips curved slightly, a shadow of a smile that made him human and approachable in a way few ever saw. He reached out, brushing a stray hair from my face, a small gesture of care that felt monumental. The city lights reflected in his eyes, and I realized how deeply I wanted to trust him, to let the past dissolve into the safety of now. We found a quiet bench near a fountain, water glistening under lamplight, and he gestured for me to sit. I never expected to meet someone like you, he said quietly, voice tinged with vulnerability. I let a small laugh escape, partly nervous, partly relieved. Nor did I expect to save a stranger and have it change everything, I replied. We both settled into silence for a few minutes, watching the ripples in the fountain, letting the shared tranquility wash over the tension of previous nights. Adrian spoke again. You have no idea the kind of life you interrupted, the solitude I carried. And yet you stepped in unafraid. I glanced at him, noting the faint crease of concern on his forehead and the depth of emotion behind his composed exterior. Sometimes, I said softly, all it takes is one choice to alter everything. He nodded, acknowledging the truth in my words, and for a moment, the world seemed suspended, the city's hum fading into the background, leaving only the soft connection growing between us. The night carried us forward as if time itself had granted pause, a rare gift where trust and understanding began to weave silently into our shared story, a prelude to futures yet unspoken, yet somehow already felt, every glance and gentle movement laden with meaning and anticipation. The city lights shimmered across the water as Adrian and I remained beside the fountain long after the evening crowd had disappeared. The air had grown cooler, but neither of us seemed ready to leave. Something important still lingered between us, something unfinished. For weeks I had carried questions. For weeks he had carried answers. The fountain continued its gentle rhythm, while silence settled around us like a quiet promise. Adrian finally leaned back and looked toward the night sky. His expression was thoughtful, distant, as if he were revisiting memories he rarely allowed himself to touch. There is something I never told you, he said softly. I turned toward him. His voice carried a weight I had not heard before. What is it? For several seconds he said nothing. Then he smiled faintly. Not the confident smile the world saw in interviews or business meetings. This one was different. Honest. Vulnerable. When I woke up in your cabin that night, I knew exactly where I was. I frowned slightly. You did. He nodded. Not immediately. But after a few minutes, yes. The confession surprised me. I had always assumed he left because he was confused or disoriented. Adrian looked down at his hands before continuing. I could have stayed until morning. I should have stayed. His gaze lifted to meet mine. But I was afraid. I almost laughed. Afraid was not a word I associated with Adrian Romano. He noticed my reaction. Not of the storm, he said quietly. Not of being stranded. His eyes softened. I was afraid of what it meant that a complete stranger had helped me without asking for anything in return. The words settled deep inside me. The fountain echoed softly nearby. Adrian continued. My entire life, people have approached me because of who they thought I was. What I could provide. What I could do for them. He paused. That night you did not know my name. You did not know my position. You did not know anything about me. His voice lowered. And you still stopped. Emotion tightened my chest. I remembered the rain. The darkness. The moment I decided to turn my truck around. A simple decision. Nothing extraordinary. Yet somehow it had changed both our lives. Adrian released a slow breath. After I left your cabin, I told myself I would forget about it. A small smile appeared. That lasted less than 24 hours. This time I laughed softly. He laughed too. The tension that had followed us for weeks seemed to disappear. Adrian shook his head. I kept thinking about you. My heart skipped. He did not look away. Your kindness stayed with me. The city lights reflected in the fountain behind us. Everything felt strangely still. Peaceful. Like the world itself had paused to listen. I reached into my purse and removed the watch he had left behind. Adrian stared at it before smiling. You kept it. I almost returned it. His smile widened slightly. I am glad you did not. We sat there together beneath the glow of distant streetlights, no longer strangers connected by chance, but two people whose lives had quietly become intertwined. The storm had passed long ago. The flooded roads had dried. The clouds had disappeared. Yet some storms never truly end. They simply transform into something else. Something gentler. Something lasting. And as Adrian reached over and carefully took my hand, I realized the greatest changes in life rarely arrive with warning. Sometimes they arrive with rain, a stranded stranger, and a choice to stop when everyone else keeps driving.